Hi, everyone. Welcome back. This is going to be another lecture for this year's content. We're going to be talking about the first political parties in the United States. And I know, not to ramble too much here, but I know that when I last talked to you, we talked a little bit about how government, has been a big part of the discussion in this class up to this point. And one of the things that I also want to add to that is we can really see through early government and early political parties the story of America. It can be told pretty well through early political parties and the early formation of our government because that's a big part of what's changing, what's happening. So our story that we've been telling this year has been, of course, building up, and then we've been adding to this story. But ultimately, today's discussion will be about how we can look at the growth of American society and some of the values that we have through the lens of the development of early political parties. I will point out a couple of things to you, as I always do before we get started. What I would recommend actually is that you follow along with this lecture using the notes that I have posted here in this week's agenda for January 4th through the 8th. And I would have these open. And as you're listening to this lecture, follow along with these notes. And you will see that we're going to be doing a bit of a comparison here. And I like to use sometimes things that maybe we can relate to or things that might be fun to kind of think about. We're going to approach early political parties as if we're looking at two different boxers in a boxing match. And that's the intent to kind of give you a comparison, right? We're going to look at some of the issues in a round by round sort of fashion and compare them and see who really comes out on top. And of course, if you understand boxing at all, it's scored, right? There's points and things like that. And either one person gets knocked out or there's ultimately a winner based upon judging, right? So we're not going to be having any points here necessarily, but we are going to see, in my interpretation anyway, which political party sort of wins in this particular content discussion here. So I hope you enjoy this. I certainly enjoy doing it. And without any further ado, let's get started. Let's talk a little bit about political parties and the birth of them. I would also say that as we get into this discussion, and what I would actually do before you watch this lecture is I would recommend that you take a look at this video that I have posted here, which is what are political parties, right? Check this video out, and it will give you a little bit of a additional understanding of how political parties are defined and sort of where they start. What influences early American political parties. So check that out and watch it. It's only like 5 minutes long, and it's pretty good. Gives you a nice little understanding of what's going on. So here we go. Let's introduce Thomas Jefferson, right? Thomas Jefferson and, of course, Alexander Hamilton, who will become sort of the leaders of these two political parties. One of the things that I always ask classes, and I would do the same with you here, is I would ask you to think about a few questions. When we think about the birth of political parties, we have to think about relationships because really, ultimately, political parties are born on the basis of how people sort of come together based on the relationships that they have with each other and sort of the values that they have. So some of the things that I might ask you are, what sort of things do you have in common with your friends, for example? Why do you choose to hang around with certain people? And why do you disassociate yourself from other people, right? There are things that we care about or that we have interests in, and we tend to find friends that share those same things. We could also ask the same question of when we argue with people, right? When we argue with friends, what do we argue about? What are some of the topics that we argue about? This is also something that helps us to understand and define how relationships either develop or how we move away from relationships, right? Sometimes how the things that we disagree on can drive people away from each other. We can also think about this in terms of our families, right? Not just our friends, but our families. What do we argue about when we're with family members? Are they different arguments with family than friends? Sometimes do our friends get involved in arguments while we're with our family? I don't know. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. And so it's not only when do we argue and what do we argue over. Um, we could also ask the question: where do arguments happen? Do they happen more among friends or more among family? And think about that for a minute and ask yourself why. Why do I have arguments more with my family maybe than I do with my friends? And what are some of those topics that we argue about? One of the things that I would ask you to think about is, do we argue more with our family because we're more comfortable with them, because we spend more time with them, especially during, a pandemic that we're currently experiencing? Do we tend to argue more about certain topics with friends and just like argue more about everything with family, or not? I don't know. Every family has a little bit of a different relationship, of course. Political party speaking, uh, when we look at this topic, I want you to keep these things in the back of your mind. What kind of relationships are these, and how are they developing, and how are we arguing or not arguing over certain things? So let's do this. First of all, let's define really what a political party is. And I have a sort of a boilerplate generic definition here for you on the screen, right? Groups of people who have similar opinions about important issues or problems facing the country. These groups organize themselves to get their leaders elected, right, to government offices and try to control how the government uses power. If you remember from a discussion that I had before we went on break, I talked about the fact that the definition really of political parties in the American sense really develops around people meeting together at people's homes for dinners. And the idea of having a party, right, a dinner party, develops into what's known as political parties. We can use an example of where Washington invites members of his cabinet to his house, and they start talking about various different issues. And they realize that, they have varying different points of view on how certain topics, how they should see the road of government sort of being paved on certain issues. And they differ on those things. Parties develop before this, actually, outside of the United States. We can go really back to England, and we can think about the Tory party and the Whig party and how they develop in the 16 and 1700s, and how a lot of the influences from the British model of government are sort of carried in to American politics. But if we even go back even farther than that, really, we can go all the way back to the Roman world. And in the Western Roman world, right, we won't talk about the Eastern aspect of this, but we can talk about how, the Romans developed their own political parties within the Senate as well, where we start to see different groups form. And they were actually much more fragmented than American politics are today, but they have different sort of ways of approaching problems and solutions to those problems. One of the first recognizable political parties in the United States, which was led actually by Thomas Jefferson and a group of other people. Thomas Jefferson sort of becomes the leader of this and stands out because he'll become a president, obviously, and he'll run on a platform that you'll understand later. That's known as the Democratic Republican Party. The Democratic Republican Party is a party that grew out of those people who didn't like the Constitution. Remember, we talked a little bit about what the Anti-Federalists were before. These were people who really were focused on the idea that individual rights had to be a part of the Constitution, and really demanded that a Bill of Rights be added to the Constitution, right? So Democrat Republicans sort of see the common man as, the farmer, the craftsman, those what we would consider to be at the time probably less educated people as being important, and that they wanted to see that the states had a lot more power than a national government. They were really fearful of a monarchy returning to uh, the new United States, and they didn't want to see that. They wanted to see a lot more power held within the governments, the small governments of each state. The other side of this that develops is known as the Federalist Party. And this is a group that's led by Alexander Hamilton. This party grew out of those people that really fought to make sure that a constitution was ratified, number one. If you recall, in our discussion, we talk a little bit about the Federalist Papers, right? And Alexander Hamilton is one of three people, the primary author of these letters written anonymously and published that are promoting the value of a constitution, the need for defining what government is and having a strong government, a strong central government. Federalists were in favor of having wealthy manufacturers and businessmen and really educated people be a part of the government and run the government. And they wanted this strong national government to be stronger than the states. They really felt like if the states had too much power, nothing would get done, and they would be too divided. And therefore, the Federalists, led by Alexander Hamilton, sort of rise up, promoting the idea that wealth should be, used, and the wealth of the nation should be used to support the manufacturer, the businesses, by giving them loans and things like that. If we talk about political parties, we have to talk about a concept that maybe a lot of you are not super familiar with. You may have heard the term economy before, but you won't really get introduced a lot to what economics is or what we call the economy until you're a senior in high school. But it's important to understand sort of a rough definition here of what it is. This is a very basic definition that the economy means the creation, the distribution, and use of goods and services, okay, related to how government and businesses and individuals really use money. It's more than that. It's not just how we use money, but in the definition of our understanding of this topic, and for our purposes in this class, we're going to take a look at the economy as how the government's role should be in using the tax money that government generates, right? That we ask people to pay. And where does that money go? How is it used? Is it used to support the people in general, or is it used to support a central government and businesses and manufacturers to build up the strength of the country? Economics is much more complicated overall than that. It involves a lot of other things like how we use time. One of the things that I would think of when I think of economics a lot when I studied it was the idea of supply and demand, and how our desires and our needs sort of dictate decisions that we make. And I think for those of you that think about your decision-making process now and how you approach it, how you spend your time, how you spend your money, you're going to really like the topic of economics, because it really gets into why do we make certain decisions about things that we do? What influences us to make certain decisions? And how do those decisions affect, like a ripple effect? How do they affect other things? So it's really an interesting topic. One of the things that we have to understand is what a policy is. And really, it's really basic. A policy is a plan of action. It's guidelines for how we act upon certain things. For example, a political party's economic policy, right, includes the belief that a party has about how government should collect and use taxes. So, if you're a federalist, you believe that the government its economic policy should be to collect taxes, bring it to a central bank, central location, where the government can then make decisions of how to use that money to support the entire government. If you're a Democrat Republican, you want to see less taxes collected and sent to a national government, but rather keep those taxes locally within a state and have the states individually determine how that money is used more. In fact, you just want less taxes, period, because you believe that if you keep the money the individual has that money to use, they'll use it how they see fit, and we should just trust individuals to use money for the benefit of not just themselves, but the benefit for everyone. Allies, another term here. Allies are essentially, and we've talked about allies and alliances before, but it's really countries who agree to work together for a special purpose. Allies can be long-standing allies, or they can be very short time frames, right? Alliances, or the building where allies build a purpose together, could be for social issues, economic issues, medical issues, right? Or health-related issues. In the example I give here, it could be like a war or as trading partners. But alliances are not always permanent. Sometimes they're very long, but sometimes they're very short too, depending on what it is that a country is trying to achieve, right? What is their policy? All right, so let's talk about this a little bit. Let's talk about the first part of this and understand a couple of things. Number one, during Washington's presidency, there are several issues that start to become very, very obvious. Number one, that the country has a debt. And there are different approaches or different ways of seeing how this debt should be paid. Number two, what is the role of government going to be in society? You know, as we go into the 1790s and we start to see Washington in his first and second term, he's really sort of like, for the first time, he started trying to figure this out. Like, what should the role of his cabinet be? What should the role of the president be? How much power should the judicial branch have? What is their actual power? We have these things written down in the Constitution, but nobody's ever really had to, as problems come up, how do we approach them? What is the role of government going to be in everybody's daily life? What is the role of government going to be in the issues outside of the United States? What's our economic policy going to be? We talk about this a little bit before, but what is our tax policy going to be? How much taxes should we actually ask people to pay? Taxation is a very touchy subject, obviously, right? The whole Revolutionary War was this idea that people didn't have a voice and they didn't have a say in what taxes they were paying. Well, now they do. Now they have a deciding factor. They have a voice. They have the ability to have a say in this. So what is that policy going to be? The division starts to appear very clearly when people realize we need money, but how much should we ask? Where should it go? Things like that. How do we interpret the Constitution is another issue. What does the language say, and who's the interpreter of it? At this point in the early formation of government, we start to see that role being defined. The Marbury versus Madison case is a good example of where the Constitution is challenged in the midnight judge appointments that are, basically tried to be made by Adams in his presidency, and where Jefferson sort of challenges that. And so the interpretation of the Constitution and the role of the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, comes into play here. But each political party has a different sort of view on whose role is what to understand that. And then, of course, we have to understand that there's issues in foreign policy. Early in George Washington's presidency, he makes it very clear that he doesn't believe that we should build alliances with any country because he says we're just too young of a nation ourselves. We don't have the strength to build alliances where we will join in another ally's war against another country. We can't afford that. We can't afford it economically. We can't afford it socially. So he steers away from wanting to join any alliances. However, people start to want to pick sides because they see that there could be some advantages to that. So we're going to look at how do the Democrat Republicans see foreign policy, who do they want to support versus who the Federalists want to support. And it's different. Okay. And then national debt. This wasn't, I don't think, on the original few items that I had there, but national debt and how we should approach that and how should we pay it is a big issue. How much should we pay? How much should people pay in taxes, and where should that money be spent on? What should it be spent on? Where should it go? All right. The role of government, how strong should the states or the national government be? And economic policy. How should citizens make their living? Like what kinds of business should the US government help? Should we help any businesses at all? Should we just let businesses go on their own, or should the government be involved with supporting certain businesses that could help the overall strength of the nation? And then here again, I talk a little about interpreting the Constitution. Can the national government take only those actions, right, which are described in the Constitution? We call this a literal or strict interpretation of the Constitution. Or should it have some flexibility? If you're a Federalist, you say that there should be a loose interpretation of the Constitution. One of the things that comes up early on, and you saw this in a video I hope that you watched in our last unit, was this whole argument about the national bank. Should we have a national bank or should we not? Hamilton says we should. Thomas Jefferson says no, it's a bad idea. It's just going to lead to corruption. It's going to lead to a few leaders in the nation having a lot of power, and it's just a really bad idea. And then again, foreign policy. What role should the U.S. play with other nations? Should we even have allies? And this is going to be a big topic of discussion, certainly when Adams takes the presidency, and there's some decisions that have to be made, right? All right, so what does this all come down to? It all comes down to money, I guess, power, and who's right, who's wrong, and maybe a combination of all these things. All right, so let's get ready for our battle royale. And as I mentioned to you earlier, this is like a bit of a boxing match. So let's take a look at all these issues that I have just mentioned to you. And by the way, just to point this out, I believe it's assignment 26. Yeah, 26 talks about these issues, and your assignment actually is to break these things down and answer some questions for me. These are the same issues that are sort of outlined in assignment number 26 that we're going to talk about here. So if you're struggling with some of the reading and you're like, I don't really get how we approach interpreting the Constitution here, well, maybe this video will help you a little bit to clarify some of that. All right, round one. We'll start round one with the issue of the national debt. When we talk about national debt, going into the birth of this country with the election of George Washington and then later on with the election of John Adams, we have a huge Revolutionary War debt. And we borrow a lot of money, millions and millions of dollars, from the French. And there's two different ways that political parties sort of develop of how to approach this problem. Number one, Democratic Republicans, under the leadership of Jefferson, say that Southern states shouldn't have to help pay the war debt for other states. In fact, most of the Revolutionary War was fought in the North, and they're the ones that borrowed the money, so why should Southern states have to chip in to pay for that? They didn't borrow money. Why should they suffer for that? Federalists say, look, taking over the war debt, and they're led by Hamilton in this matter, and Hamilton, by the way, was a huge proponent of this. Taking over the war debt of the states will help the economy overall and tie the states together. We are the United States, for example. We're called United States, so why shouldn't we be united on this issue? The idea here was everybody would chip in, all the states, all 13 states would chip in to cover the debt from all the states. Even if that state didn't have any debt, they would pay taxes to help pay the debt off. And of course, where would that money go? It would go to a bank of the United States, a national bank that Hamilton wanted to form, and the money would go into that central location as a way to manage it and then disperse the money out to pay off the French, who we wanted to pay off because if you pay your debts, it means that you can probably borrow more money because you have a good record of borrowing. Another part of this, and we'll call this round 2, I guess, is where the nation's capital should be located at. And this is all a part of the national debt discussion, by the way. Democrat Republicans under Jefferson said having the nation's capital in New York, in the northern part of the country, would give northern states too much influence over the government. Remember, in our time of discussion here in the late 1700s, there were no trains, there were no cars, there were no planes, of course, right? If you wanted to go somewhere, you had to walk or you had to ride in a carriage or a horse, and it took time. And it took time to get places. So a lot of Southerners were concerned that putting the capital in the North would be a really true inconvenience for them, and it would give Northerners access to government much more easily than Southerners. Hamilton said, look, we can keep the capital in New York City, where it was at that time, or we can move it farther south to Philadelphia. And by the way, Philadelphia and New York are not really that far apart if you really think about it. But in the modern world, they're not that far apart. But they're a distance apart if you look at a map from each other in the 1700s. But it was a compromise. It was sort of this idea that we'll have this kind of compromise here. All right, so who's the winner in this? Who's the winner in this rounds 1 and 2? Well, really there was a compromise that was made, right? Neither side got all of what they wanted, but they got something that they wanted. That's really the definition of a compromise, right? Southern states said that they would help. They would help pay off the nation's debt by contributing money through taxation to this new central government. And in exchange, the capital would be moved farther south, essentially to Philadelphia. But later on, what's going to end up happening is there's going to be a new area set aside for a nation's capital that will be known as Washington, D.C. Some really, really crummy swampland, actually, that was donated by an American to the government. And that's where it would be. And it would basically be on the border of Virginia and Maryland. Okay. So Maryland and Virginia would, on the border there, would sort of, they'd have this land. It wouldn't be a part of any state. It would be a District of Columbia. That's where it comes from, the idea. It would be named after President Washington as an honor to him. And that's where the nation's capital would grow from, much farther south than Philadelphia and New York. Round 3, what's the role of government going to be? Under Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, they said the states should be strong and independent, right? The common person has the ability and right to rule on their own, and a strong central government is bad. Again, the power in the hands of a few wealthy, educated people doesn't give enough credit to the common man. Jefferson sort of sees himself as a leader of the common man, a farmer, and he wants to see power stay out into the hands of these state governments. Hamilton believes that a national government should be really strong. Power should be balanced between the rich and the poor, or rich and the common people, not necessarily poor. But he also recognized and said, look, common people are not that good at making important decisions. Number one, they don't have the time because they're busy just trying to make a living. And number two, they don't know all the issues. So we need to have a group of people who have a level of education and understanding of the big global issues, right? And how to tackle them for the betterment of this nation. Again, we have another draw here in this round. They're really, today we trust that the common people have a desire, and sometimes they want a stronger national government, and sometimes they want a weaker national government. But ultimately, these political parties grow with the idea that there should be space for both. Okay, so Democrat Republicans will develop this idea that having the ability to vote and having the ability to have a say not just locally in politics, but nationally will be really important. And then the Federalists also see that there is value in having support from farmers, not just manufacturing and businesses, but that there has to be a strong central government to sort of manage all this. Round 4, economics and economic policy. Jefferson and the Democrat Republicans say the U.S. success is based upon farming. It's based on agriculture. And the U.S. will succeed if most of its citizens actually become farmers, because he says they're more independent. You know, a farm is independent. It's like its own business. A farmer's not successful unless they can manage their time, unless they work hard, unless they manage their money and save. And, farming, if you've looked anything at farming at all in your life, farming is a really difficult job. There's a lot of ups and downs in it. And farming requires a 24/7 kind of work ethic. Hamilton and the Federalists said, look, our success, farming is important, but our success lies in the growth of business, specifically in manufacturing. The U.S. will succeed if we diversify our manufacturing. We support businessmen and merchants, because he says merchants make the best citizens. He would say merchants pay more taxes, technically, because more things are passing through their hands, and that there's this idea of capitalism growing here among the Federalists. The idea that with incentives, people will want to work harder to make more money, and that money can be taxed. And the more money you make, the more successful you are. And that's kind of how Hamilton and the Federalists would sort of see the nation, too. Ultimately, Hamilton's going to kind of win in this particular round, because what we're going to see is the development of a national bank after much arguments between both parties. We're going to see this bank be able to collect taxes on a national level. But I also will say to you here that agriculture is also a business, and it's a big part of business, especially today in the modern world, as a lot of large-scale farming has diversified and it's become like big corporations. But ultimately, early in America's story here, businesses and manufacturing will win out on this, because they're going to start to grow at an exponential rate. Though the farmers do grow food and other things, we're not going to start to see large-scale agriculture start to develop until like the mid-1800s, or I would actually say like the 1830s and 40s, when we start to see it grow really big in the South, where the South, then they'll start paying taxes and things like that at a higher level. But most farming early on in American history is small scale. There's not a lot of surplus, but that will change over time. Round 5, how do we interpret the Constitution? A couple ways to approach this in a simple way is to think about what I said earlier about a strict interpretation or a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Jefferson and the Democrat Republicans see that a national government shouldn't be able to take any action unless it specifically says it in the Constitution. That's a strict interpretation, or what we say a strict construction view, right? The Constitution does not give Congress to create a national bank, because it doesn't say specifically in the Constitution that it can, and that's why they argued that point. One of the things that they said is this could get out of hand, right? If it's not in the Constitution as a part of what government can do, then government will just get out of control, like an octopus with all these different sort of tentacles going out, doing whatever it wants, and that's dangerous. I mean, that's a way to think about how Jefferson and the Democrat Republicans would sort of see this issue. On the other flip side, Hamilton and the Federalists were, advocates of the idea that we should interpret the Constitution loosely, because that's the intended purpose, right? The national government should be able to take any action as long as the Constitution doesn't specifically say it can't do it. In fact, there's a part of the Constitution that Hamilton argues and says that there's a clause that's known as the necessary and proper clause, or what we call the elastic clause, like a rubber band that can be stretched. And then the Constitution was designed to be elastic. And I've mentioned this to you before, that the founders, when they wrote it, left some things to be very vague, left them open-ended. And my interpretation was that they knew that the country was going to change, that it was going to grow, that over time, economic, social, political, foreign policy issues would change, and we would have to adapt to these things. And if it was too strict, it would cause too much conflict. So I'm not saying that I necessarily believe with everything that Hamilton believed in, but I take the necessary and proper or elastic clause within the Constitution to see what Hamilton's trying to do here, that it has to be flexible. And if you interpret it too strictly, nothing will ever get done. It'll be like mud, trying to walk through mud. You won't be able to get anywhere. The national bank is a product or is an example of this loose construction idea by the Federalists, that the bank should be formed to protect investments in a very, very controlled manner for the benefit of the country. Well, ultimately, this is a draw too, because we are still interpreting the Constitution and what it means even in 2021. That's why the role of the Supreme Court becomes so critical here, right? In 2020, when we see, in President Trump's term, when he has the opportunity to nominate 3 members to the Supreme Court, lifetime positions, we see how this becomes so important for his political party, the Republican Party at this time, but also how it's going to shape future policies that we will have as a nation, right? Our interpretation of what the Constitution is what the judicial branch is there to do. And ultimately, the last stop in this decision-making process is the Supreme Court, right? So Supreme Court justices become really critical in understanding their influence over American policy, both socially, economically, for generations to come. And so we're arguing that issue even to this day. So there's really no winner here. They both, he gets a black eye and he gets a bloody nose, but it's a draw. Round 5, the national bank. I think you kind of might know where this is going to go because I've mentioned it already, but Jefferson and the Democrat Republicans said the Constitution does not give Congress the power to create a national bank because it's a strict interpretation of the Constitution, and therefore it doesn't say it can create a national bank, so therefore it shouldn't be allowed to do that. And of course, Hamilton says it's a loose interpretation, guys. A strong national bank will encourage businesses to grow, and it will protect the investment that people makes in this country. The taxes will be protected from being squandered, and they'll be directed to the policies that the government wants them to go to. So here we go. We've had a national bank for many years in this country. It's called the Federal Reserve. And you will learn a lot about the National Bank or the Federal Reserve, I hope, in high school when you take economics. So great stuff. Foreign policy. How do we approach our relationships with other nations? Well, under Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans, they supported the idea of having a strong relationship with the French. They considered them that they were our brothers in liberty. They helped us during the American Revolution. They helped us with naval support. They helped us with giving us loans to fight the British, right? Hamilton and the Federalist Party say we should support Great Britain. They're our closest brethren. We speak a common language. In fact, many people in the late 1700s had relatives that were actually living in England at that time still, and that they were their closest trading partner. So even though we had a war, trade is still there, and there's a lot of trade going on, and we don't want to mess that relationship up. So we should build close bonds with the British, the Federalists would say, and the French are unreliable. In fact, they're led by a monarchy, and the monarchy is very unjust. And even though England has a monarchy, at least we understand that monarchy more. If we go into a little bit more of the background of both Jefferson and Hamilton, we'll understand that Hamilton grew up in the British West Indies. He's very influenced by British sort of policy. And Jefferson really had a positive relationship with the French. He spent a lot of time in France. He was an ambassador to France, and when he becomes Secretary of State under Washington's administration, he will spend a great deal of time in France. He spoke French fluently. The French really loved Jefferson. He sort of understood the French mind, that relationships are fostered over time, and you socialize, and you don't get to business right away. You get to know each other a little bit, and that takes time. And one of the reasons why John Adams was such a disaster when he went to France to try to build a relationship with the French is because he was so direct, and he didn't have a lot of patience for the French culture, and they didn't like him. And they didn't like him, and he didn't really like them that much. But Jefferson was the complete opposite of that. Ultimately, the Democrat Republicans are going to win this round, as we're going to find out that there's some embarrassment that happens under Adams' presidency that you're learning about, I hope, in this unit, about the XYZ affair. But we're going to make some demands on the British, and they're not going to comply. And ultimately, we're going to go to war again with the British in 1812. It's called the War of 1812. And in our next unit, we'll talk about that war and what are some of the factors that led up to that, how long did it last, and the relationship with the British has been tumultuous in early American history. I would say in the modern world, in the 20th century, in the 19th century, the latter part of the 19th century, our relationship with the British is probably one of the closest alliances of all nations in the world. But it wasn't in 1812. In fact, it was very bad. Another part of this foreign policy was trade. Trading with France, which was our Revolutionary War ally, versus supporting Britain, who was our closest trading partner. So again, I say to you, we will end up building a pretty good relationship with the French when it came to this idea of, let me back up here a little bit, when it comes to this idea of a war that was being desired between the French, or actually between the British and the Americans. But when it comes to trade, we've always sort of been close to the British. What's going to end up happening in the late 1700s, 1798, 99, is the French Revolution. And what we're going to see is that France is going to go into a huge turmoil for several years. Napoleon Bonaparte's going to rise as a leader of France. He's going to try to take over most of Europe. And the French will have what's known as a social revolution versus America, which had a political revolution. And so there's a lot of people who are purged from society in France, which creates an unstable relationship trade-wise between the French and the United States. And even though the British, we end up going to war with them in 1812, prior to that, our trading relationship with them becomes really strong, actually. And we'll see how that sort of plays out in the War of 1812. Okay? All right. So, ultimately, as we look at a summary of some of these things, it really is sort of a give and take here between these two political parties. There's differences of opinion, obviously, between Jefferson and the Democrat Republicans and Hamilton and the Federalists, but it really does come down to how is power used, how is money used, how do we interpret the Constitution, what is right and wrong in that respect. And ultimately, all this is leading to a division in the United States. It's leading to a division of two political parties. It's not that there hasn't been other political parties that have risen up in the United States over time. Some of them have faded and gone away, and some of them are still around. In fact, we have many political parties in the United States. However, the two major political parties that start are the Democrat Republicans and the Federalists. Later on, I'll talk to you a little about in class actually that these two names are not, they haven't morphed identically into what we know today as the Republicans and the Democrats, okay? There are differences because time shapes attitude, right? Time shapes a lot of things. So when we look at the Federalists, we wouldn't necessarily say that they're a carbon copy of what would become the Democrat Party. And we wouldn't say that Democrat Republicans would be exactly what the Republicans would be, okay? Because there are changes in that. They're also, it's good to sort of look at how parties are developing in England at the same time, the Whigs and the Tories, and sort of how they sort of develop. But we won't do that in this class too much, but maybe in high school when you start to study world history a little bit more, you'll start to see how this relationship sort of is similar, okay? All right. I believe a couple final thoughts for you is, where do we start to see the nation go from a state standpoint? We start to see Democrat Republicans, the power base of that political party, started to develop in the southern part of the United States. Remember, a lot of the focus by this group, led by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, who will become the fourth president, obviously, the power base is among farming and agriculture and what we would call the common man. And a lot of their needs are being expressed by people that live in the southern part of the country, which is primarily an agricultural foundation. And I would say even parts of like Virginia here, which is not, it's not pointing to that, but it's Virginia and southern Pennsylvania. On the other side of this, the Federalists sort of gained their power base in the New England states. Again, this era is pointing to New York, but there was manufacturing and business development throughout the eastern seaboard here, from Boston to New York City, even into, actually this era is pointing to Massachusetts, but along here in Manhattan where New York is and into Pennsylvania, we start to see manufacturing and businesses grow at a pretty rapid rate. And so I want us to keep this in mind, where these parties are existing, north and south. And Washington, D.C. here is where my cursor is sort of this little dot here, which is on the border of Virginia and Maryland. This will become like neutral zone. I guess you could think of it like that, as a neutral area. But Virginia was a southern state, and it was heavily southern. It was heavily agriculture. And Maryland was sort of like this transition zone between the south and the north here. Keep this in mind as we talk later on about how the nation's going to really divide itself on another big issue, which was the issue of slavery. And as we go into the 1800s, specifically into the 1840s, 50s, and then 1860 and 1861, the nation's going to really divide politically based upon this sort of imaginary line between North and South, led by political parties that have these long-standing ideas about independency of states versus a not strong central government, et cetera. Okay. So, yeah, that's pretty much what I wanted to talk to you about today. Again, I hope that you were able to follow along with the notes on this. Please use the notes to help prepare for any exams that we have here. And I know this video was rather lengthy. Watch it in segments, of course. I would recommend 20, 25 minutes at a time, and then take a break and then come back to it. But we will talk more about some of these issues together in class. And that's where we're going to stop today. So thanks for all of you that listened, and have a great day. Bye.